December of '65. 40 miles northwest of Sarkingrad, the frigid air hummed with frost. Inside the cramped metal box of a P-12 radar station's command post, 3 men hunched over circular screens, their faces bathed in an eerie, sickly green glow. These were not Vietnamese. They were Soviet advisors, the elite of the air defense forces, the best of the best. The men who had woven the most advanced anti-aircraft shield on the planet. For months, this war had been ridiculously simple. American F-105 Thunder Chiefs and F-4 Phantoms came roaring in from the Gulf, fast, heavy, and overconfident, and desperately predictable. They flew in tight formations that Soviet radars detected from 80 miles out. The moment they switched on the "1" guidance radar, the brain of the formidable SA-2 missile battery, panic would grip the Americans. The green dots on the screens would flare up and scatter chaotically like a disturbed anthill. They would blindly drop their bombs into the jungle and dive to treetop level, desperately trying to break the lock. The mere touch of the radar beam on their fuselages was enough to send them fleeing. This was exactly how the system was supposed to work. The SA-2 was the king of the sky, the weapon that 5 years earlier had plucked Francis Gary Powers and his U-2 spy plane from stratospheric heights. The weapon that allowed the Citadel to sleep soundly. But today, the rules of this Cold War had fractured. The range-finding officer muttered matter-of-factly, his fingers resting on a black Bakelite knob. The senior advisor, a colonel who had dedicated his entire career to studying American tactics, leaned forward, peering at the screen. He was looking at a single dot. 1. It was strange. Americans always attacked in packs, as they called the reconnaissance pilots. The colonel ordered, his voice steady, without a hint of doubt. Routine. A single target against an SA-2 battery wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Outside, on a clearing concealed by camouflage netting, the massive silver cigars of the missiles stirred on their launchers with a hydraulic hum. Even in the van, they could feel the Fansong radar antenna begin to emit its high-frequency beam, piercing the sky in search of the American intruder's metal skin. The operator reported. This was the moment. In every single engagement until today, the American pilot should have panicked by now. His warning system should be screaming. He should have turned away, dived, fled. But the dot on the screen didn't flinch. The colonel frowned, his eyebrows knitting together. The green blip remained frighteningly stable. It wasn't leaving. It was turning. The rangefinder said, a note of bewilderment in his voice. The colonel tapped the screen's glass with his knuckle, as if trying to break a spell. Check the gain. Is he descending? Negative, Comrade Colonel. Holding altitude. Straight on the azimuth. He's flying right at us. A ringing silence fell over the cramped box, the hum of the cooling fans suddenly deafening. It was tactical madness. Flying head-on into an SA-2 site with active guidance was pure suicide. It was like stepping in front of a loaded rifle. The American pilot was making himself the easiest target in the history of ballistics. The closing speed was increasing. "Launch!" the colonel roared. There was no time to analyze this insanity. If the American wanted to die, they would not deny him. The button was pressed. Outside, the very ground shuddered. A pillar of fire erupted from the V-750 missile as it shot off its rail, accelerating to Mach 3 in seconds. The roar was apocalyptic. A new swift dot flared on the screen, the missile. It was racing toward the slow-moving American. The intercept geometry was perfect. The probability of a kill was over 90%. The crew froze, watching the two luminous dots converge relentlessly. 10 seconds to contact. 5. Target. Holding course, the operator breathed rather than said. His voice held not fear, but reverent awe. He's not evading. The operator's voice trembled, cutting through the tense silence of the command van. Then, the unthinkable happened on the radar screen. The American dot didn't explode. It didn't vanish. Instead, a third tiny dot detached from it. It broke away from the American plane, but it wasn't a bomb. Bombs fly in an arc, obedient to gravity. This object spat on gravity. It was accelerating. It tore away from under the American fighter's wing, leaving a thin trail of white smoke, and flew faster than the plane that had launched it. It wasn't falling toward a target. It was defiantly climbing. It was hurtling along the invisible beam of their own radar, like a predator following a scent trail straight to the lair. "What is that?" the operator yelled, leaping from his seat. "Incoming projectile! Speed is off the charts!" The colonel's eyes reflected the terror of pure, primal incomprehension. The laws of physics, drilled into his head over years of service, were crumbling. The Americans didn't have radar-homing missiles. They had dumb, gravity-bound bombs, unguided rockets. But this was impossible. "Shut it down!" the colonel bellowed, his voice cracking. "Shut down the radar! Shut it!" He never finished. The world exploded in a blinding white light and shrapnel. The warhead of the American missile detonated directly above the Fansong antenna. Thousands of tungsten cubes shredded the fragile electronics, the parabolic dish, and the command van, turning them into sieves. The strike was surgically precise and utterly devastating. A rescue team reached the site 3 hours later. The humid, suffocating air seemed saturated with the smell of burnt metal and ozone. The mangled remains of the command van were still smoking, like a funeral pyre. The first reports, fragmented and frantic, flowed to the high command in Sarkingrad. From there, via encrypted teletype channels, they raced to Volsk. The initial assessments were steeped in chaos and disbelief. Survivors, deafened and bleeding, mumbled about a ghost. An American plane that didn't attack, but merely teased, luring them out like bait. And they whispered of a weapon that could see their invisible eyes, their radar. It was unthinkable. In the 1960s, radar was the god of war, the all-seeing eye of the modern army. You had to turn it on to see the enemy. But what if turning that eye on meant willingly putting a pistol to your temple? The entire doctrine of air defense was collapsing like a house of cards. In the offices of the Volsk Union, chief designers read the reports, their lips curled in contempt. Crew incompetence, operator hallucinations, a stray bomb hitting by chance. They found dozens of explanations to avoid admitting the obvious. But then, it happened again. 2 days later, a different battery, but the scenario repeated with diabolical precision. An American plane enters the kill zone. The radar acquires the target. The American turns, feigning an attack. The battery launches, and in response, the American releases its small, swift missile, which rides the radar beam straight home. The deadly dance was performed once more. The battery was annihilated. The first chill of panic ran through the ranks of the air defense forces. The S-75 SAM system, their indestructible weapon meant to guarantee Soviet air superiority for the next 20 years, had suddenly become fatally vulnerable. The crews gave these American machines a new name. Not fighter bombers, not interceptors. Something far more sinister. Predators that hunt the hunters. If the Americans could blind the S-75, the skies over the Republic of Sarkhan would be defenseless. B-52 bombers could arrive as if on parade, turning factories, bridges, and supply lines into rubble with impunity. But the tactical defeat was merely a shadow of the strategic nightmare. The Volsk Union supplied the S-75 to all its allies. They stood guard over the Caribbean alliance. They protected the Nile Confederacy. They formed the steel shield of the Iron Bloc. If the Americans had a master key to this lock, then the entire defensive system of the Volsk Pact was nothing but a sham. The stakes skyrocketed. In the corridors of the citadel, confusion gave way to an icy, paralyzing terror. The entire Soviet military doctrine was built on the superiority of surface-to-air missiles. They knew they couldn't compete with American aviation in a head-to-head fight. The U.S. Navy and Air Force could put thousands of planes in the air daily. The Soviet answer was a wall of missiles, an impenetrable fortress of electronics and explosives designed to make the very idea of air superiority obsolete. They invested billions of rubles in the S-75 Dvina, known in the West as the SA-2. It was the pinnacle of their engineering, the pride of their defense industry. The system was complex, reliable, and absolutely lethal. At least, that's what they had believed until this day. At least, that is what they thought. Now, reports were coming from the tropical jungles, which they called the rainforest, that refuted the fundamental laws of this war. In one report, a major, shaken to his core, described an engagement. This psychological aspect was the most terrifying. American pilots weren't just dropping bombs on coordinates. They were personally hunting the air defense crews. They were engaging in a deadly duel, a staring contest at 1,000 kilometers per hour. Who were these pilots? What madman would fly a single-engine plane straight into the maw of a missile battery? And what technology were they using? Soviet specialists frantically sifted through the wreckage found at the strike sites. Among the twisted metal and charred circuit boards, they found fragments of guidance systems, unlike any bomb they knew. This was no accident, and it was no ghost. It was a new, blood-curdling reality. Soviet advisors in Sarkhan were ordered to keep their radars off, but you can't shoot what you can't see. When the radars were silent, American bombers ravaged supply lines with impunity. When the radars turned on, these phantoms appeared from nowhere and burned them to the ground. It was checkmate. Soviet generals realized they were facing a crisis that threatened their entire global influence. If they couldn't protect the skies over Sarkhangrad, how could they protect the skies over Volsk? They desperately needed answers. They needed to know what this weapon was, how it worked, and most importantly, how to stop it. The investigation began immediately, fueled by fear and a crushing sense of sudden, humiliating vulnerability. They were looking for a technical solution. They were looking for a machine. They didn't yet understand that the most dangerous part of this equation was not the missile or the plane. It was the men in the cockpits. The Soviets were about to meet a new breed of American airmen, a squadron of volunteers whose motto sounded like a bad joke, but was followed with religious fanaticism. You gotta be shitting me. By early 1966, the rainforest in the Republic of Sarkhan had become one vast crime scene. Special technical units of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, were dispatched to the smoking remains of radar stations. They didn't come to bury the dead. They were there to sift through the earth for the murder weapon. The pressure from Volsk was suffocating. For decades, the Citadel had assured the world of the invincibility of the Soviet air defense system. They sold this promise to the nations of the arid states, the eastern continent, and the buffer states. Now, that promise was burning in the rice paddies of the jungle frontier. Every destroyed battery was a public relations disaster for the Soviet military-industrial complex. In a makeshift laboratory near Sarkingrad, Soviet engineers laid out the fragments on rough wooden tables under the harsh glare of bare light bulbs. Mangled and scorched, these pieces of metal told a story. They found fragments of a rocket motor. It was compact, far smaller than the massive S-105 missiles the Soviets possessed. It was built for maneuverability. Then they found the guidance head. And it wasn't a transmitter. It was a receiver. The lead engineer, a man accustomed to the brute force of Soviet engineering, froze as he stared at the elegant electronics. He ran a trembling hand through his hair as a chilling realization struck him. The Americans had created a weapon that didn't need to, quote, a target. It only needed to, quote, it. It was a vampire. It fed on the very energy their own radars emitted. The more powerful the Soviet signal, the brighter and more attractive the target became for the American missile. They identified the weapon from stenciled markings on a surviving stabilizer fin. The Americans called it the, quote, the discovery sent a shockwave through the high command of the Air Defense Forces. For 20 years, the fundamental rule of radar had been power equals detection. To see farther, you had to pump more kilowatts into the sky, punching through any interference. Now, the Americans had turned that power into a fatal vulnerability. Their greatest strength had become their fatal weakness. To turn on a fan-song radar against the new American planes was like lighting a beacon in a pitch-black room, knowing a sniper already had you in their sights. You saw the room for a moment, but the sniper saw you. The technical explanation for the threat was frightening, but the psychological pressure was immeasurably worse. The reports flowing into Volsk were filled with desperation. The morale of the air defense crews was collapsing. These were not just soldiers, but highly skilled specialists, technicians who prided themselves on their scientific precision and composure. But above all, they were human. They began to fear their own equipment. In the cramped command vans, an operator's hand would hover over the transmit button. Each of them knew that the moment the ominous high-voltage hum ran through the wires, an invisible timer on their life would start. Somewhere out there, in the inky void of the night sky, an American pilot was waiting for that exact frequency, like a predator waiting for the cry of its prey. A grim, almost mystical legend began to spread among the crews. Operators whispered that the Americans could sense their radars even before they warmed up, that the Hunter aircraft were always nearby, circling like silent sharks, unseen and unheard until the moment the radar beam pierced the darkness. Soviet advisors, trying to turn the tide, resorted to shouting. They demanded iron discipline from the Vietnamese crews. Keep the target locked until missile impact. Don't switch off for a second. They thundered, pounding their fists on the table. The Vietnamese would reply quietly but firmly. It was a cruel, impossible choice. The S-75 system required a continuous stream of data from the radar to guide the missile to the American plane. The moment an operator cut the transmission, the Soviet missile became a blind, unguided projectile, a useless piece of metal coasting into emptiness. The Americans had cornered Soviet tactics, forcing them to choose between destroying the enemy and their own survival. Doing both had become impossible. This deadly hesitation tore gaping holes in the once impenetrable air defense shield. American strike packages began to break through sectors where radar crews were paralyzed by fear, unwilling to press the button. B-52 bombers and F-105 Thunder Chief fighters poured into these gaps. created not by technology, but by human terror. In a desperate attempt to stop the slaughter, Soviet tactical committees fixated on analyzing the Shrike missile's behavior. They needed a loophole, a weak spot. They studied the wreckage, pored over combat logs, and searched for a pattern. And they found one. The Shrike was a primitive weapon, a first-generation anti-radiation missile. And it had a major flaw. It had no memory. If the target radar was turned off after the Shrike was launched, its guidance head would instantly go blind. The missile had no internal map, no GPS coordinates. It only had a unidirectional ear aimed at the source of the sound. When the sound disappeared, the missile was lost in space. Soviet analysts in Volsk breathed a sigh of relief. They thought they had found the Achilles heel of the American coup. A new tactical directive was immediately developed and issued. Pulsed mode. Orders flew to the batteries in Sarkin. The new tactic was risky, but theoretically flawless. Operators were instructed to turn on their radars for only a few seconds, just long enough to acquire the target, launch, and immediately cut the signal. Then came the longest seconds of their lives. They had to sit in silence, listening to their own heartbeats and counting, praying the American Shrike would fly past. After that, they were to turn the radar back on to make a final course correction for their own missile. It was a deadly game of with death. On, off, on, off. The Soviets congratulated themselves on a brilliant discovery. They were certain they had figured out the trick, that the American Shrike was just a technical gimmick that could be defeated with the flip of a switch. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong. All their attention was focused on the hardware. They looked at the AGM-45 Shrike missile and saw only a circuit board with its limitations. They assumed the American solution was purely technological, weapon carried by regular line pilots. They never understood that the Shrike was merely the tool. The real weapon was the man in the cockpit. The Soviets assumed American pilots would act like rational machines, that a rational pilot, having fired a missile, would immediately break away and escape the return fire. After all, a rational pilot wants to survive above all else. The instinct for self-preservation is a law of nature, and any rational pilot under fire seeks to survive. But the pilots flying these missions acted against all logic. Radar operators began reporting events that defied any technical analysis. Even when Soviet crews used the, quote, 60 tactic, turning off their radar, the American planes didn't leave. They stayed. They circled right in the kill zone, as if taunting death. One report from late 1966 described a battle that stunned the Soviet advisors. A battery engaged a single American aircraft. They launched, immediately shut down their radar to confuse any incoming Shrike, and waited. But when the radar came back on 10 seconds later, the American plane wasn't farther away. It was closer. It hadn't retreated. It was drawing them out. The Soviets were trying to hunt a machine, but they were being hunted by psychology. They had encountered a group of volunteers who had become a wolf pack. The Soviets called them the madmen. The Americans called themselves the Wild Weasels. The investigation hit a dead end. The blinking tactic sometimes worked, and American missiles would fly into the jungle or crash into rice paddies. But the radar stations continued to burn, one after another. Soviet generals puzzled over the coordination. How did the Americans pinpoint which radar was active with such diabolical precision? The sky was vast, the tropical forests impenetrable. And yet, the very instant a Fansong radar came to life, an American fighter already seemed to be in the perfect position to strike. They suspected everything. A vast network of spy planes, ground spotters, a breach of their encryption codes. It never occurred to them that the Americans had managed to miniaturize signals intelligence technology. They didn't know that in the cockpit of each of these specialized F-105s was a new screen, a vector display that gave the pilot a godlike view of the electronic battlefield. The Soviets were fighting a war of ballistics. The Americans were fighting a war of information. By 1967, the investigation had turned to desperation. The Soviet advisors were losing their best specialists. The Vietnamese crews, gripped by terror, began to mutiny. What had seemed like an incredible mystery had become a grinding, bloody routine. The Soviet High Command had no choice but to escalate. If they couldn't trick the American missiles, they would have to overwhelm them with numbers. They began shipping in new systems, more advanced radars, and sophisticated jamming equipment. But as soon as they changed frequencies, the Americans adapted. There was an eerie feeling that the enemy was sitting at the same table during their briefings. The mystery grew darker. It wasn't just what the Americans were shooting, it was how they dared to fly. What training program could produce pilots who would deliberately fly their heavy, bomb-laden aircraft straight toward a missile traveling at Mach 3, all for a single shot? The Soviets concluded they must be convicts on suicide missions or fanatics on combat stimulants. No professional pilot in their right mind would accept a mission with a 50% loss rate. They had yet to learn that these were not convicts. They were the most highly trained and technically gifted aviators in the entire Alliance Air Force. And they weren't just baiting missiles. They were creating a new form of warfare that would shatter Soviet military doctrine for the next 40 years. While the Soviets studied the wreckage of the Shrike, trying to figure out how to trick it, the Americans were already preparing the second part of their deadly trap. The mystery was about to turn from defensive panic to an offensive slaughter. While Soviet generals in Volsk chased ghosts and blamed their own crews for failures, the answer to the mystery was waiting on a scorching runway in the kingdom of Belara. At Andersen Forward Operating Base. The heat here was as oppressive as in the Republic of Sarkin, but the air was different. It was thick with the smell of burnt jet fuel and cold sweat. To understand the incredible, suicidal behavior the Soviets were witnessing, you had to see where the idea was born. Back in the Alliance, at Nellis Air Force Base, the Air Force Command had realized by 1965 that they were losing the air war. SA-2 missiles were mercilessly wiping out their aircraft. Standard methods, jamming pods and evasive maneuvers, were no longer working. Bombers were dying. The tactics weren't working. Bombers were falling from the sky, shot down by an unseen enemy. The Pentagon needed a solution, and they needed it now. There was no time to develop a new stealth aircraft. A desperate measure was needed, here and now. So, a top-secret task force was formed with a simple, chilling mission. Go to the Republic of Sarkin, bait the surface-to-air missile sites, and destroy them. The project was codenamed Quote 71. The first briefing for the volunteers has gone down in military lore. When Captain Jack Donovan, an electronic warfare officer, was shown the mission diagram. Fly a modified fighter straight into the teeth of enemy missile batteries to provoke a launch. He slowly turned to the instructor. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated disbelief. And then he uttered the phrase that became the unofficial motto of the entire program. The Soviets expected a technological marvel. The Americans answered with desperate improvisation. They took old, proven airframes, first the F-100 Super Sabre, and then the massive F-105 Thunderchief, and crammed them full of experimental electronics. These were not the sleek, futuristic machines the Soviet engineers imagined. The F-105, affectionately nicknamed the by its crews, was a beast, the largest single-engine fighter in history. Heavy and deafeningly loud, it left a thick trail of smoke. With a full load of fuel and munitions, it struggled to get off the ground. But in the air, it was fast, carried tons of ordnance, and could sustain horrific damage, returning to base looking more like a sieve than an airplane. But the main secret to the American success was not the pilot. It was the man sitting behind him. A standard fighter has one man. The Wild Weasel F-105 had two. The pilot flew the plane. The man in back was the electronic warfare officer, the god of electronic warfare. Pilots called them, quote, 77. The Soviets never even suspected the bears existed, assuming the pilot handled everything alone. In the cramped rear cockpit of the Wild Weasel, the EW was literally buried under a wall of black boxes and dimly glowing green screens. This was the source of the magic the Soviets were hunting. Not one brilliant chip, but a suite of analog sensors, the APR-25 and APR-26. To the uninitiated, this equipment was just a chaos of static and white noise. But to a trained EWO, it became a map of invisible death. The system worked by detecting the unique radar frequencies used by the Soviet SA-2 complexes. As soon as a fan-song radar began to scan the sky, a distinctive crackle would sound in the EWO's headset. The sound was unmistakable, a rhythmic, chirping whine. Simultaneously, on a small circular screen called the vector display, a green line would appear. Its length indicated the signal's strength, and thus the distance to the radar, while its direction pointed straight at the threat. The system was crude, but it gave the Americans something they never had before: total situational awareness. Over the intercom, the EWO would call out to the pilot, 79-280. This was the moment when Soviet operators would see on their screens what they mistook for confusion. The American plane would abruptly change course. But it wasn't confusion. It was the EWO directing the pilot to point the fighter's nose directly into the heart of the radar beam. They were flying down the thin green line on the screen, as if it were a thread leading straight into the beast's lair. The most terrifying element in the cockpit, the one that gave birth to this suicidal tactic, was a tiny red light on the instrument panel. Above it was a single word: launch. The APR-26 system was smart enough to detect the specific change in the radar signal that occurred the moment Soviet operators switched from search mode to target acquisition mode. As the fan-song's beam narrowed to guide a missile, its pulse frequency would instantly change. In that same second, the red light would flash, and a piercing, rattling buzz would erupt in the crew's headsets. Pilots described it as the sound of a rattlesnake, warning of a deadly strike. This was the incredible event from the beginning of our story. The moment the Soviet colonel gave the order, "Fire!" and the missile blasted off its rails, the American crew already knew. Any sane pilot would have immediately gone into a dive. But the Wild Weasel doctrine was built on denying instinct. Their Shrike missile had a shorter range than the Soviet SA-2. To strike, they had to fly toward their own death. Outranged by the Soviet SA-2 missiles, the Americans were forced to play a deadly game. To destroy a radar, they had to get close. Not just close, agonizingly, terrifyingly close. They had to fly straight into the enemy's jaws and wait for him to make the first move, until the fateful light flashed on the instrument panel. And as soon as the Soviet crew pressed the launch button, the trap sprang shut. Their radar was now fixed in place. The beam had to stay locked on the target to guide the missile. This was the entire plan. The Wild Weasel crew would race toward death, listening for the ominous buzz they nicknamed, and then the light would flash on. In that instant, the pilot knew. Down below, the Soviet operators, glued to their screens, were completely absorbed in guiding their deadly weapon. It was at this moment of enemy vulnerability that the pilot's finger would close on the trigger. Magnum, the code word for a Shrike launch, would crackle over the radio. The white-hot projectile would leap from its pylon and, riding the radar beam, race straight for its target, the emitter van. Soviet analysts, as the second part of the investigation showed, had correctly identified the Shrike's Achilles heel. The missile needed a continuous guidance beam. But they could never have imagined the asymmetric response the Americans devised. Understanding that the primitive Shrike would lose its target if the radar shut down, the Wild Weasel crews gambled on pure, ferocious aggression. Along with their missiles, they also carried conventional bombs, CBU-24 cluster munitions, and high-explosive ordnance. Now, if a clever Soviet operator switched off the radar to throw the Shrike off track, the launch light in the Weasel's cockpit would go out. The missile would fly into nowhere. But the plane itself was already there, and its pilot now knew exactly where the enemy was hiding. Instantly switching from missiles to bombs, he would tear over the jungle canopy at 600 knots, unleashing a deadly payload of cluster munitions directly onto the suspected position. Thus, the Soviet tactic was turned against them. Leave the radar on, and the Shrike gets you. Turn it off, and the bombs get you. It was a no-win situation, born of American ingenuity and multiplied by the desperate courage of the pilots. The Soviet command saw this as total superiority. The crews flying the missions felt only chilling terror and adrenaline. In 1967, flying a Wild Weasel sortie was statistically one of the deadliest missions in the history of warfare. It was no wonder their patch read, "In the officers' club at Anderson Forward Operating Base, they drank heavily." Their humor became as black as the scorched earth below them. Every one of them knew they were the bait. Their job was to fly ahead of the main strike package of F-4 Phantoms and F-105 bombers. They had to create so much electronic noise that every radar in the Republic of Sarkhan would turn toward them. Their entire flight profile was a silent scream. "I'm here! Shoot me!" And while the Soviet crews desperately tried to shoot down the brazen Weasel, the main force would slip through to the bridges and factories unscathed. The pilots themselves called it trolling for SAMs, a lethal game of chicken played with high explosives. And despite the primitive technology, vacuum tubes, analog dials, and unguided rockets, the Americans were winning. They were forcing the Soviet crews to sit quiet and keep their heads down. The secret to their success lay not in the machines, but in a strategy that turned the enemy's strength against him. The more powerful the Soviet radar, the brighter it shone on the Weasel's screens, and the easier a target it became. But this game couldn't last forever. While the Americans honed their skills, the Soviets were not idle. They were preparing a surprise of their own. They were about to introduce a new variable into the equation, one that couldn't be dodged or jammed. For the Americans, the mystery of the SAMs was solved. They knew how to hunt and kill. But for the Soviet side, the true realization of what they were up against would come with a stunning enemy intelligence coup. The cat-and-mouse game was about to escalate to a new, more brutal level. And the coming revelation would show the Soviets just how hopelessly they had fallen behind. By 1968, the deadly game in the skies over Sarkin had reached a bloody stalemate. The Soviets had trained the North Vietnamese crews in the blinking tactic, forcing the radars to flash on and off in an attempt to deceive the American Shrike missiles. The blinking tactic allowed them to fool the American Shrike missiles, but it came at a terrible cost. In response, the Americans would saturate the SAM sites with cluster bombs, turning the confrontation into a brutal, bloody tug-of-war. But in early 1968, this fragile balance was shattered. A North Vietnamese search party, combing an area near Port Varon, stumbled upon a muddy, cratered hole. Their mission was to find the wreckage of an unexploded American missile. What they pulled from the mud was nothing like a Shrike. The Shrike was a small missile, about the size of a standard air-to-air weapon. This object was a beast. 15 feet long, massive and heavy, it was packed with electronics that looked like they belonged on a spaceship, not a weapon of war. The wreckage was immediately crated and shipped to the Volsk Union, directly to a specialized research institute in Volsk. When Soviet engineers opened the guidance section of this new weapon, a dead silence fell over the laboratory. The blood drained from their faces. They were looking at the AGM-78, known to the Americans as the Standard Arm. If the Shrike was a reflex, the Standard Arm had a memory. The real blow to the Soviet High Command wasn't an explosion on the battlefield. The bomb went off in the quiet offices of the Citadel, where the lab report was delivered. The engineers explained, this new missile solved the "105 problem once and for all. The AGM-78 was equipped with a target location memory circuit. The moment a Soviet Fansong radar operator switched on his station, even for a split second, the missile's seeker head would lock on to the signal's geographic coordinates. And if the terrified Soviet crew immediately shut the radar down, it no longer mattered. The missile didn't need to hear them anymore. It remembered where the sound came from. It would fly a calculated ballistic arc, correcting its course with internal gyroscopes, and detonate precisely over the silenced van. The realization of this truth hit the Soviet generals like a physical blow. Their entire tactical doctrine, the hard-won blinking method, the iron discipline and caution in emissions control, all of it was rendered useless in an instant. The Americans had lured them into a perfect trap. They had forced the Soviets to rely on the very tactic this new weapon was designed to defeat. The psychological impact of the standard ARM was colossal. The Wild Weasel pilots were no longer gambling with death. Now, they were executing a death sentence. Panicked telegrams flew from Sarkin to Volsk. Soviet advisors reported that crews were refusing to man their posts in the vans. The mere presence of an F-105G, the upgraded Weasel, in their sector was enough to paralyze the entire air defense network. The Wild Weasel had evolved from a nuisance into a dominant predator. They didn't even have to fire. They just had to show up. Soviet operators knew that if they emitted a single pulse, somewhere in the sky, a computer-guided robot killer with a 200-pound warhead was already calculating the end of their lives. The shock was compounded when Soviet specialists examined the quality of the American components. In the Volsk Union, vacuum tubes were still the standard for powerful electronics. reliable, but bulky and slow. The American guidance systems used solid-state transistors and early integrated circuits. They were miniature, lightning-fast, and an order of magnitude more reliable. The generals realized with horror that they weren't losing a war of courage or ideology. They were losing a war of industrial capacity. America's consumer electronics industry, the companies making radios and televisions for ordinary citizens, was driving a military revolution that the cumbersome Soviet command economy simply could not match. Panic breeds desperate measures. Realizing their radars had become death traps, the Soviet command ordered a radical change in tactics. If they couldn't use radar to guide missiles, they would have to take a step back into the past. The SA-2 batteries were equipped with an optical system called Karat, essentially a powerful telescope mounted directly on the launcher. The idea was simple and insane. An operator would have to visually find the American plane in the sky through an eyepiece and guide the missile to the target with a joystick, without ever turning on the tracking radar. It was an act of pure desperation. It was an act of desperation. Try to imagine looking through a telescope at a supersonic fighter jet moving at 600 miles per hour and trying to shoot it down by steering a missile with a joystick. It was a near impossible task. The accuracy of the Soviet missiles plummeted. The kill probability, which had been nearly 90% in the early days of the war, dropped to a pathetic 5%. Thousands of missiles were fired in vain, soaring uselessly into the sky or crashing senselessly into the ground. The Karat system became a symbol of failure, a tacit admission that control of the electromagnetic spectrum had been completely lost. The Soviet response in the air was just as hopeless. Humiliated by the brazen Wild Weasel raids, the Air Defense Command demanded a weapon that could hunt down and destroy the hunters themselves. They turned to their new engineering marvel, the MiG-25 Foxbat supersonic interceptor. The MiG-25 was a masterpiece of brute, unstoppable power. Capable of flying at Mach 3, it could catch and outrun any American aircraft. The Soviets bet on speed, believing it would solve everything. The plan was simple and brutal. While the Wild Weasels circled the radar sites, the MiG-25 would dive from the stratosphere like a bird of prey and crush them. But once again, they missed the point. The Americans had anticipated this threat. Wild Weasels never flew alone. They were part of coordinated hunter-killer teams, operating in tandem with F-4 Phantom fighters, armed to the teeth with air-to-air missiles. Moreover, the Americans employed electronic warfare pods. They flew in tight formations of 4, creating an impenetrable wall of electronic noise. When a Soviet MiG-25 pilot looked at his radar screen, he didn't see 4 separate targets. He saw a blinding wall of static. He couldn't lock on. He couldn't guide his missiles. He was the fastest thing in the sky, but he was completely blind. It was a total rout. The harsh truth dawned on the Soviets. The Wild Weasel was not just a plane. It was an entire system. A lethal combination of brave pilots, advanced microchips, homing missiles, and jamming pods, all working together like a single orchestra, playing a symphony of destruction. Soviet generals, clenching their fists, watched as their multi-billion-ruble investment in the S-75 Dvina missile system literally evaporated into thin air. The weapon designed to be the indestructible shield of the communist world had been defeated, not by a more powerful missile, but by a smarter technology. First, they were stunned by the audacity of the bait. Now they were paralyzed by the technological genius of the trap. The war would drag on for years, but the main verdict was already in. The sky belonged to whoever controlled the invisible war of electrons. And in that war, the Soviets were fighting with one hand tied behind their back. The final chapter of the Wild Weasel campaign was written in the skies over Sarkingrad on Christmas of 1972, during Operation Linebacker II. The Alliance unleashed the full might of its strategic air power against the enemy. Wave after wave of B-52 bombers tore into the heart of the Republic of Sarkin. This was the moment of truth, the one Soviet military advisors had been preparing for 7 long years. The final exam for their vaunted air defense system. They threw everything they had into the fight. Over 12 days, North Vietnamese crews, operating under Soviet doctrine, fired more than 1,200 SA-2 missiles. In 1965, one such missile almost guaranteed a downed American plane. If the crews from the start of the war had been operating, there would have been nothing left of the U.S. Air Force. But in 1972, those 1,200 missiles managed to shoot down only 15 B-52 bombers. The kill ratio hadn't just dropped, it had evaporated. It took nearly 70 telephone pole-sized missiles to bring down one American aircraft. The sky turned black with smoke and fire, but the American armadas pressed on to their targets, undeterred. Why? Because at the vanguard of every strike wave were the Wild Weasels. They jammed enemy frequencies. They fired standard arm missiles that remembered radar locations. They dropped bombs on any site that dared to transmit for even a moment. They had turned the most formidable weapon of the Cold War into a grand but useless fireworks display. Impressive, loud, but utterly ineffective. Soviet generals, reading the dispatches in Volsk, realized the devastating truth. Their shield was broken. The Americans could fly anywhere they wanted, and whenever they wanted. They could fly anywhere and anytime. The defeat of the SA-2 systems was more than just a military failure. It was a symptom of the systemic collapse of the Volsk Union. The Wild Weasel War exposed a gap that neither steel nor propaganda could bridge. The Soviets were titans of the industrial age. Their genius produced giant missiles, impenetrable armor, and roaring engines. But the Americans had moved the battlefield to a new dimension, the information age. And while Soviet factories, following the plan, churned out thousands of fragile vacuum tubes for their radars, American engineers were perfecting the microchips that became the brains of anti-radiation missiles. The Soviets desperately tried to catch up. They stole blueprints, bought components through front companies. You could copy the technology, but you couldn't copy the culture that created it. The Wild Weasel mission demanded not obedience, but audacity. It required the ability to think independently, to break free from standard procedures and improvise in the face of death. Soviet military doctrine was built on an unshakable principle: strict obedience. The pilot was a cog in the machine, his eyes fixed on the ground, waiting for orders. The American Wild Weasel pilot was the machine, the decision-making center. This stunned the Soviet command, whose philosophy was, the system protects the soldier. The American philosophy, forged in the skies of Sarkin, asserted the opposite. The soldier breaks the system. The echo of those first chilling flights of 1965 did not fade over Sarkin. It reverberated through the decades and thundered over the sands of the Republic of Zahan in 1991, when the Alliance launched Operation Desert Storm. The air defense of the Republic of Zahan, built on the Soviet model, was a dense, impenetrable forest of radars and missiles. A system described as, "It didn't last a day." A new generation of Wild Weasels in F-4G Phantoms stormed into the Republic of Zahan's airspace, bringing with them the tactics born in the jungles of the rainforest and honed over 2 decades of a technological arms race. They unleashed high-speed anti-radiation missiles, direct descendants of the original Shrike. The Republic of Zahan's radar operators, trained by Soviet instructors, knew all too well what would happen next. They were seized by a paralyzing terror that froze their will. To turn on a radar was to sign your own death warrant. The few who dared died in a blinding flash, without understanding a thing. The entire defensive network of a mighty military power crumbled, not under the impact of hundreds of bombs, but from fear alone, fear of the Weasel. Today, the rusting hulks of SA-2 launchers stand silently in museums in Sarkingrad and Volsk, mute monuments to an era when the world believed the sky could be conquered with brute force. But the mission is not over. Wild Weasel is no longer the code name of an operation. It is a philosophy woven into the very fabric of the Alliance Air Force. Today, the F-16CJ and the F-35 Lightning II carry that torch. The technology has advanced. Missiles are smarter, planes are stealthier, radars are digital. But the essence, the very secret that once shocked Soviet generals, remains the same. And it wasn't about the microchip or the rocket fuel. It was pure, primal, reckless audacity. The audacity of a pilot willing to fly into the face of a lethal radar beam, to stare into its invisible eye, and when the red light flashes on the panel, signaling imminent death, to smirk and say, "You gotta be shitting me," and then fly his machine straight into hell.